Okay, so thanks so much for joining again and coming back. This is being recorded, so if you have to miss or leave for some reason, or if you want to watch it again to rehear everything I've said, you have that opportunity, and I will be posting that again after following the session. I will send out an email to everyone with a link to where to watch it and then all of the resources and things from today. So just to review a little bit, there we go. So today we're looking at putting the BOOF for the Biliteracy Unit framework in practice, and we're going to talk about different strategies for language learning, and then we'll have the opportunity to see the bridge in action, which and the video demonstrations are replacing the classroom demonstrations that we were hoping to have. I'm still hopeful that someday we'll be able to do walkthroughs, even if you're already teaching, still having that opportunity to go around and visit other teachers and other classrooms to see the different styles, the different strategies, and just to build that professional learning community as a dual immersion team. But unfortunately, we have to resort to video at this point in the year and video of other people, which I'm sad about. So reviewing a little bit, and if you are muted, this is going to have some response I'm asking for you. So get ready to unmute yourself, because these are not for you to just reflect on, but actually have a discussion. Who benefits the most from dual language education?
All students.
Yay, that's the correct answer. Choice, that would be the one. All students, right? So all too often dual language gets lumped or put under the umbrella of English language learner support or kind of intervention for English language learners, but that's definitely not what it is. We know that students from all walks of life at every socioeconomic level with every language background benefit from having dual language education because it builds more cognitive ability. It makes the brain build neuroplasticity and stay more flexible. So we know it's beneficial for all students. Oh man, I got so excited. What are some of the benefits of dual language education?
A better job.
Okay, yes, a better job. So if you are fully bilingual, you have access to hopefully more lucrative opportunities.
It helps in our brain, our skills in our brain.
Yep, it builds a lot of the skills in your brain with neuroplasticity and making more pathways and connections so you can analyze quicker.
More linguistic resources.
Perfect. Yeah, and more linguistic resources. And we didn't talk about this before, but there is a lot of research around if you know more than one language, it's easier to keep accumulating languages the more you know. So we're also helping students theoretically of if they know 2 languages, it's easier for them to then later learn a 3rd, learn a 4th, or some of our students who are trilingual will have so much added benefit of their linguistic repertoire. Okay, so then
Twice as many authors you can read in their original language.
Yes. Oh my gosh, yes. I hadn't even thought about that. And all the different cultures you can access too. And then what are some barriers to dual language education? And that can be in general or Bremerton School District specific.
The learning process takes a little longer, or we see the outcomes, it takes longer for the outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lack of equity with resources.
Yes.
It takes a certain amount of grit to get through from beginning to end.
Yes. Oh, great. Great ones. You guys nailed it. So, and it's like you're studying, and if you weren't, that's fine. I'm just going to assume you were, and you read the book over the weekend. So like everyone said, it takes, the learning process takes longer, and to add on what Sally said, it takes a lot of grit to get through. Grit from students, grit from staff members, but then also from parents too, to understand that, you know, it's a long-term process and it takes time, and there will be highs and there will be lows. And then as Lucy said, there is some inequity in in resources. I think it's in one of the earlier chapters when it talks about teachers, that it's not, we sometimes get this idea of, if you can speak Spanish, then you can teach Spanish, which, while that's true, it's not on the role of the teacher, and it's not authentic to be asking the teacher to just translate all these materials. And so it creates an inequity. And then last, what are the goals of dual language education? And this can be broad or it can be specific.
Leveling the playing field.
Mm-hmm.
Having students become bilingual, biliterate, and multicultural.
Good answer,
Global-
Eve. I like that one.
Yeah.
We also want to help our students to become citizens of the world.
Oh, good one. Yeah. So, and that connects to what Eve said too, right? With, not just bilingual and biliterate, but also bi or multicultural, so that they are more accepting, more understanding. They're able to be a better citizen of the world. And then, of course, we do want, from the school or administrator standpoint, it does help level the playing field. It closes the achievement gap time and time again that Thomas and Collier have showed us. And that we would have students that, in addition to all that, are on grade level in reading in 2 languages, or on grade level in math and science and social studies. So all the same goals that we have for any student. So we're going to start. If you're following in your book, I tried to map it out so we're kind of following the book pattern as we go, and we're not jumping around too much. So if you do have your book and want to kind of be walking with us a little bit, we're starting on chapter 5, where it starts to look at linguistic resources and linguistic creativity. So we're going to start with looking, understanding language acquisition. So this graph shows us the brain development of our language center in our brain. So from 0 to 3 is when you're having the most growth as a child, just in basic child development. And if any of you have had children, I'm sure you've seen this in starting with the babbling, and they're watching you. And that's why, as teachers and as people, we know that it's so important to be having interaction with your child. Even if they can't understand you yet, they're starting to develop and understand language. And this is the time too where you hear that kids have access to all phonemes and all sounds. We have access in our brain to make all of those different sounds and understand all of those different sounds. But as we get older, towards this end of the sensitive period, our brain starts to mature, and we lose some of those language or linguistic abilities that we didn't have because we never used them. And so our students are right here. And so even though we have this idea of simultaneous versus sequential learners, we still are considering our students that enter in enter kindergarten as 5 or 6 year olds as simultaneous bilinguals, because they are still developing that language part of their brain, and they do still have access to all of those different sounds. As a personal, and not personal, but as an anecdote that might be relatable, like if you know people that can roll their R's versus people that can't, if you never practiced rolling your R's when you were a child before that language center fully matured and developed, then it's going to be a lot harder for you to try to go back and learn how to do that. And then same with some of the consonant confusion between languages, where sometimes different consonants will sound different depending on who's saying it, or some can't tell the difference when they hear a consonant. It sounds the same because if you didn't have to use it when you were younger, your brain just went away with it. It saved the space. So we want to make sure that we're hitting our students in as early as we can to really try to capitalize on that linguistic development of the brain. it would be great if we could work with kids too in preschool to have more bilingual preschools, and we do have some in the areas, but that's not something we can necessarily require or have just yet. Also, I really like this graph just because it always cracks me up a little bit of looking at this and knowing what we know with brain research and development about language acquisition. In the US, we are typically not required to take a second language until age 14, 15, which by that time, our brain has developed a lot of language. So not that we can't learn it, but it becomes much harder. So it always just cracks me up a little bit on the irony of how that doesn't work. Another way to look at it, and this document is a PDF that you have access to in our resource folder. This looks at dual language acquisition a little more from a sequential bilingual standpoint. So again, it's just another way to view our students and where they're at on their linguistic journey. But starting from 0 to 6 months, even though babies aren't learning to speak yet, or they aren't able to speak yet, they're starting to pay attention and they're starting to recognize different phonemes and different sounds that they're hearing. And so, they hear something and they turn their head to it or they turn their attention. So they're already starting to develop their listening skills. And then once we hit age 5, theoretically for our students, that's when they're entering into our classrooms as a dual language or a dual immersion kindergartner. And so again, they start this process of learning another language and going through different periods of language development. For bigger trainings with teachers that aren't specific to dual language, but just for thinking of our English language learners in general, this is always a really important thing I like to focus on, are the different stages of language acquisition, because it usually starts out in the first 6 months with a silent period, which is very uncomfortable for teachers. And 6 months in the classroom, if they start in September, that's getting you all the way to January, February. And that's a long time for a student to not really be using a lot of the language that you're trying to teach. So understanding and being sensitive to the fact that even if they are not responding and not producing as much language as you would like, they are still engaging with it. They are still learning and practicing. It's just not always as quickly as we would like. What's beautiful about kindergartners is a lot of times they will try things out without caring. They have that self-confidence and don't know to be nervous to try out a language. So they will usually do it a little quicker, but just something to be aware of. The other thing that's really important about looking at this, about this timeline or development of language acquisition, is we notice that listening and speaking are pretty much always developing before reading and writing. When you're looking at students at this age who are earlier in life, listening and speaking will develop first, and that will lead into reading and writing. And that's really important when thinking about designing our curriculum and how we teach, because often we jump into the reading and then back up and we'll talk about it or listen or practice with it. But in thinking of how our brain and how our language really develops, it's so important to be starting with that listening and speaking. And again, if you have your book, page 68, there's a section titled Sequential Bilingual Development, and that really goes through these same kind of stages that's described on this slide and in this document, looking at starting with more of a nonverbal period and then moving into shorter sentences and then practicing vocabulary. So we start with all of this background on language development because when we go into the BOOF or the Biliteracy Unit framework, it follows, they took into account when they developed this template for us, that listening and speaking always comes first, that you start with building oracy before we ever get into reading and writing. So on that, where do I start? Well, before you're going to ever develop oracy, anything like that, same in any planning, you're always going to start with standards, right? We have to have our lessons be standards-based. In thinking of how we in Bremerton School District would use this framework, this is not a replacement for the curriculum. We have our curriculum, whether that's Wonders or Maravillas, or our FOSS kits or Eureka Math. This is not something that you are going to replace at all. We're not making our own curriculum, but this is a framework or a template to help organize how you are teaching a unit to make sure that it is most supportive for language development. Because no matter what class you're in, 50% of your students are learning a new language, minimum 50% are learning a language. Even if they've had some exposure with it, still, they are language learners. So we want to make sure that how we're organizing and presenting all the information and content, no matter what that is, that we are planning it for maximum language support and language building. And this too is another reason when we talked last session about students who have another language background and why we still would like to put them in dual immersion is having this context in mind that every lesson, every unit is designed for maximum language exposure and development. So we always want to start there. And with the standards too, it also has the language development standards, which you might not be as familiar with, but I can always provide those for you. But every state, including Washington, has English language development standards for our English language learners. And then we also are in the process of adopting Spanish language development standards too. So they're very similar to our Common Core state standards, but they get into what you should be able to do in the domains of reading, writing, listening, and speaking. So more information on those come. And then just a line. The BOOF always starts with standards-based planning. Okay. How are you feeling? Any responses, any reflections so far?
Great, it all makes sense. I think we know a lot of that stuff just from our own experience.
Good. And you don't have to throw in anything. This isn't a quiz part, but just something to be aware of too. So with that, if you were planning and we're developing a lesson, we're always going to start again with building oracy and background. Oracy and background are together because, as you know, in any situation, we have to be aware of our students and what they know and what they're coming with, to also be able to understand how we need to develop background information so that they can access the unit. And sometimes this gets skipped over, I think, a little bit in our curriculums. They will just jump to like, all right, do a KWL chart. Okay, done, and move forward. But we really have to develop some of that background. Just as another kind of anecdote, and Denise, I think this is from you, so feel free to chime in if you'd like. But we need to be aware of, and here are some guiding questions. There's a unit or a book in Maravillas that talks about the carnival or the fair. And it's a lovely book, but if none of our students have ever been to a carnival or seen a fair, then, there has to be some background understanding of what that is, why they're there, what's the purpose, and how does that relate to anything that they're doing. So questions to consider when you're building oracy and background are, what are my students' interests? So knowing your students and how is this going to connect? How are you going to capitalize off what they like and what they enjoy and get them excited? And then back to, what are their funds of knowledge? So what are they already coming in with as background knowledge before this, or that you can capitalize off of? And then when you're designing your part of the unit around building oracy, we need to focus on that academic language that they're going to need for this whole unit. So here's where you would identify what words and vocabulary that students are going to need for this unit, but then also with that are appropriate for word study. So when we say word study, we'll get down to that lower, but word study is referring to phonics, to those basic reading foundational skills of how you're going to decide word choice, how to spell, how to read, things like that. And I'm pausing because this is being recorded, but this is where we start to deviate a little bit sometimes by following the curriculum 100% as prescribed, because we will get vocabulary that might be great vocabulary, but does that vocabulary match developmentally where these students are? And this is especially true when we start using maravillas and developing Spanish literacy, because while in kindergarten, to have a book about an ant, A-N-T, makes a lot of sense in English, when they translated it into Spanish, ant in Spanish is
Hormiga.
hormiga. Thank you. I was like, I know you know it, and I couldn't remember it, quite honestly. So that was my response time. So it doesn't saying hormiga, which is now a 3-syllable word that, you know, jumping students into in the beginning of kindergarten doesn't make sense. So when you're designing that unit, it might force you to think a little more critically and maybe play with some of those vocabulary and word choices that your curriculum is providing you, and maybe making some changes about how you should do this. So we are going to, if you're following along in your book, we are on chapter 6. So chapter 6 begins the chapter on building background knowledge and also with developing oracy. And I would really like to draw your attention to it too. For the first page, page 78 and then 79, gives a little information to just, especially for our Spanish speaking teachers, to be understanding and to think very openly about how students are using language. And it reiterates the point that words that students may be using, their word choice in Spanish, are not always necessarily wrong, but sometimes they're using them differently. So there's just a little bit, like when we get to this idea of Spanglish, or there's some words in Mexico that mean a little different than they do in Guatemala, vice versa. So just trying to be aware of, if you're developing oracy, making sure that you are focusing, even if it's a word you think students should know, that you're being attentive to developing those words. So we're in chapter 6, if you want to open your book to that, to follow along. And now here's where things are going to get really exciting. So be excited. Hope you're on the edge of your seat. Because we are not able to go see a live classroom demonstration, we are doing some videos. And so the videos that we are going to look at, there's a series of 3 videos that we'll watch today. Each are between 12 and 15 minutes long. Developing oracy is what we're going to start with right now. And the unit you're about to see, so it's developing oracy, and this is one of the first lessons in the whole unit. So hopefully it won't need too much explanation. It is going to be in Spanish, and one of the reasons I really like that it's in Spanish is because it's great to pay attention to, even if you don't speak Spanish, what language are you able to still gain or understand from this? And the series of videos are designed so that we start with developing oracy, and then the next 2 videos we'll watch are from the same unit. So it really is like we are going progressively through a biliteracy unit framework, and this is where we start. A couple things just to kind of guide what you are thinking about or taking notes on. Paying attention to what strategies or instructional moves you see, and then what language are you hearing from students. And this is a dual language classroom, so 50% of the students are, well, they're all simultaneous bilinguals, but 50% of them each have a different language background. So something to pay attention to. Okay, so then on that note, I am going to I'm going to mute everyone, and it is 12:34. So at 12:50, I'm going to unmute everyone and rejoin us back, and we'll discuss and kind of debrief the video with this slide, because it's a 15-minute video. You ready?
Yep.
Okay.